Hey everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold, and this is our weekly lecture series. And this lecture is about the Candidates Tournament of 1959. And this is good timing for our sponsor. I want to thank our sponsor, Philip Siller, and mainly I want to thank him because his first name is the same as my middle name, and he actually spells it the same, which is, I think the way we spell it is unusual. So anyway, thanks to Philip Siller for sponsoring the lecture. If you want to sponsor a lecture, contact my wife Karen. Her email is karen@atlchessclub.com. And we can sponsor a lecture about whatever topic you're interested in. Now, the Candidates Tournament isn't always the Candidates Tournament. However, it was in 1959, and it was 2 weeks ago when I was at the Candidates Tournament in Toronto, 2024. And there's three kinds of Candidates Tournaments, and there's probably a fourth that I don't know about. So if you're one of those nitpickers on YouTube, you can, say, oh, you forgot about this kind. So the three kinds are that I know of are double round robins, and that's the one that happened in Toronto. Double round robin is when you play everybody twice. And that's what happened in Toronto. Okay. Everybody played everybody twice, once with white, once with black. The other kind of candidates is the one that happened here, and Wikipedia talks about the whole cycle, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And that's where you play everybody 4 times, which is a quadruple round robin. And that's very rare now. However, between like 1938 and 1970, it was more common as a format to have quadruple round robins. And then the third kind of candidates is not a tournament. And we saw that a lot in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They have what are called candidates matches. And I don't like candidates matches as much as the other formats because it takes too long. Candidates matches need several sites, which is expensive, and it has to go over a period of maybe 8 months. And what you do is you have just matches between the players. Like here you can see Tal, Keres, Petrosian, etc. You'd have, let's say, Tal versus Smyslov, and then they'd play a match, and somebody would win the match. Then there'd be another match between the winner of, let's say, Fischer and Keres. And then you just keep having matches. So you'd have a quarterfinal, a semifinal, a final, and the winner of all these matches would play the world champion. I don't really like that system. I like where everybody plays everybody, 2 or 4 times. It's hard to play people 4 times because that takes a month. It's hard to get a playing site for a month and to hold up interest for so long. Tournament. Now, the cycle for the event that we're talking about started in 1958. There was an interzonal tournament, and they took the top players from the interzonal tournament, which you can see here in green, and they played in the Candidates Tournament. And the interzonal tournament was pretty strong. A lot of famous players did not qualify, like Bronstein, Averbach, Szabo, Pachman, Pano, etc. Larson, mainly, etc. Okay, then they had the Candidates Tournament, which is what this lecture is about. And Tal won the Candidates Tournament, so his prize was to play for the World Championship, the same as Gligorić, who just won the Candidates Tournament now. And World Champion, when Tal won the Candidates, was Mikhail. So they had a rule back then, which they don't use anymore, that if you were playing for the World Championship, your name had to be Mikhail. Hard to understand. Okay, so then they have the World Championship match. Tal beat Botvinnik very convincingly, and Tal became the world champion. And so this Wikipedia article talks about the whole cycle. Now, the Interzonal, the candidates tournament, which we're talking about, was held in 3 cities. It was in Bled, which I've been to, Zagreb, and Belgrade. So in cities that used to be in Yugoslavia, when Yugoslavia existed. I was in Bled once because I was in Maribor, Slovenia for the World Youth. I was a coach, and we took a day trip to Bled and Ljubljana. But we weren't there very long. But anyway, I had heard of those cities, so that was good. Now, the sponsor of the lecture has rights. If you sponsor a lecture, you can actually somewhat dictate what the lecture is going to be about. And so the sponsor of this lecture indicated there were 2 or 3 Fischer games that I should be showing. So I did. And I'm also going to show a game Tal won, because Tal won the tournament. That seems like nice. And he qualified, Fischer did, when he was 16. And my dad played Bobby Fischer in 1963, and my dad thought Fischer was about 5th in the world when he played him. And this is 1959, so he was top 10 in the world, but he was only 16, so he wasn't really a favorite to win. And in fact, he tied for 5th out of 8 players. Okay, now, even though this event was held in 1959, there's a lot on the internet about it. And one of the games I'm going to show in this lecture, Tal Smyslov, there's actually a picture of the game. This is the actual game. That's the demo board. That position occurred. So that's Smyslov on the right. Smyslov, I've played twice. I beat him in a simul, and I drew him in Lloyds Bank 1988. And Tal I've never played, and I don't think I've ever spoken to him, but I've seen him. And seeing pictures from 1959 of guys playing chess of the game that I'm looking at, pretty impressive. Now, I guess the clock is on the right. It's just a really weird looking clock. Okay, and as per usual, the arbiter's sitting there doing nothing. So, typical arbiter. Okay, and this is like some games from the tournament. Then, if you want to buy the book on the tournament from 1959 and see if it gets to your home before this lecture comes out on YouTube, 50-50, there's a tournament, Candidates Tournament 1959, Bled, Zagreb, Belgrade. It has the dates. It's got good ratings and so forth. And I assume it has cross tables and all the games and some stories. And also there was an article written in 2018 from ChessBase about the candidates tournaments in 59 and 62, and there's some pictures. And the cross table, and pictures of Tal, and games, and so forth. There's Fischer at the tournament when he was 16. So the internet has quite a lot of information about this tournament from 1959, which is pretty impressive because, you know, 1959. The players were very strong. Tal was victorious. Paul Keres was second. Petrosyan was third. Smyslov fourth. And of the 8 players who played in the event, at one time or another, 4 of them would be the world champion. And in fact, when this event took place, it was the year after Smyslov won and then lost his world championship match to Botvinnik. So Smyslov had been the world champion. Then Tal, Petrosian, and Fischer would become world champions, obviously. And Keres, a lot of people think, is the strongest player never to become world champion. And some people think it's Korchnoi. But okay, Korchnoi didn't play in this event because it was 1959. He would have been a bit young. Okay, let's get to the games. I think because of the complexity of the games, I could probably spend 45 minutes on each game, but I typically don't do that. So we usually discuss some critical variations, but I also want to talk about the history and such. So this is Fischer Gligorić, and if the audience wants to be confused, which the audience often is, in February of '88, I played Gligorić at the World Chess Festival in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada, and we had a relatively quick draw. I just realized now, I've never realized it before, that I played Smyslov in '88 also. I knew I played Smyslov, I knew I played Gligorić, but I didn't realize I played them in the same year. And I was 18 years old during those games, and they were older. Gligorić was one of the top players in Yugoslavia and former Yugoslavia for about 40 years. And he was top 10 in the world for quite a long time. Fischer had white, and they played sort of a suspicious dragon, because it didn't start out as a dragon, but then it did. So this is the classical Sicilian, which I play with black, and I have a chessable course about basically this position. And Fischer played bishop c4, and that's called the Fischer-Sozin. So if I was Gligorić and I was playing somebody that the opening was named after, I'd be a little afraid. Okay, and Gligorić played bishop d7, which I don't give in my course. I usually play e6 myself. I used to play queen b6. And queen b6 is the move that I suggest in my course. And there was a game played in the candidates 2.5 weeks ago where Firouzja was black, and he played queen b6, and he didn't follow my course. He played his own strange moves, and he lost very quickly. That was one of his worst losses. Okay, so Gligorić played bishop d7, bishop b3, and now he played g6. He's trying to transpose into a dragon Sicilian. And by trying, he's transposed into a dragon Sicilian. Without playing the dragon move order, played another move order, and decided to play g6. Okay, and then Gligorić played knight a5, which is very unusual. And looks like a dragon. h6 is a little weird. Now, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, most people thought the dragon was almost winning for white. And then 70s, 80s, 90s, people found better ways to play for black, and it was very complicated. And occasionally, a super GM, even Kasparov and Carlsen, when they were world champions, would play the dragon with black. Okay, and here Fischer did something weird, which even today, a lot of people don't agree with. And Fischer explained that in this position, it was more important to keep this bishop. And Fischer's better than me, so I have no comment. And he played the move queen e2, giving up his dark squared bishop, which is a very unusual thing to do in the dragon, because usually that queen and bishop are attacking on the diagonal, and usually black plays knight takes or white plays bishop takes and gives up the white squared bishop. But as Boris Spassky once said to me, Fischer liked his white squared bishop. So Fischer preferred his white squared bishop over his dark squared bishop, so he gave that one away. Castles, and we have a typical dragon where black attacks on the queen side and white attacks on the king side. Plays e6, blocking the bishop. And the knight goes back to e2, very Karpovian, defending the knight on c3 and opening up the d file since d6 is now not defended so well. Very aggressive play by Fischer. So really exciting game. And I don't want to say unfortunately, but nowadays, you don't see a lot of games like this in candidates tournaments where both sides are getting checkmated and it's really exciting. Probably the last candidates in Toronto was pretty exciting compared to other ones where most of the games are draws. This one seemed to have a lot of decisive results also. But candidates tournaments, interzonals, world championships, 40, 50, 60 years ago, I mean, we saw these kind of exciting games. At some point, they would be analyzed and they would conclude, nah, this is good for white, or this is good for black, and then they'd stop playing one side of it, and we wouldn't get to see these exciting games. King B1, always play King B1. Black wants to trade queens. Fischer says no. Queen D3 attacking the pawn on D6. And Gligorić makes an unusual decision to give up his bishop because the knight on E2 is overworked. So in this position, white wanted to take on D6. Black's taking on C3. And if white takes with the pawn, that doesn't look very good. If we take with the knight, we're giving up our F pawn. So bishop takes C3 is a very aggressive move, putting the test to Fischer which way he's going to take back. He sacrificed his F pawn. And now Fischer could get his pawn back with queen takes D6. But that doesn't seem like a good ending for white because white's pawns on the king side are isolated. So Fischer played queen F3. Obviously, he'd like to play queen H3 and give checkmate, but the knight's defending H3. And knight back to H5. Fischer is Fischer, in case you forgot. So rook takes H5. If I didn't know the game, I would have guaranteed white played rook takes H5. Sacrificing on the king's side. Now in this position, white's idea is to play rook H1 and queen H8 mate. And black can try to run away with his king or defend the way that he did. He played bishop E8, defending his pawn on F7. So there's no rook F1 business. Queen H6. So white wants to play G6, but G6 is not recommended because of rook takes queen. So Fischer plays queen H6, which not only stops the king from running away, but now we can play G6. And in this position, Gligorić played rook takes C3, sacrificing the exchange. Always sacrifice the exchange. And there was a note that somebody wrote on the internet that said black should play rook to A5 with the idea of if the rook goes to H1, we have queen D4 defending the mate. And somebody replied that E5 is a good move because whichever way black takes on E5, white can play rook H1, the E5 square is occupied, so you can't defend H8. And if black does nothing, then white also could play knight E4 to F6, which is also checkmate. But okay, I mean, rook H1, queen here, checkmate looks pretty good too. Okay, so he sacks the exchange. Now, if Fischer plays rook H1, then queen D4 would stop the checkmates against black's king. So he played BC3. Material is now equal. Rook takes C3, black is a pawn ahead. And then G6. And after G6, black's king side is falling apart. He took. Now, if I was white and it was a blitz game, I would try to play bishop takes E6 check If it was on the internet, it wouldn't work. If it was in real life, I would lose the game because the bishop's pinned. I would make an illegal move. But Fischer played rook h1. That's better. Now, white is threatening queen h8 check, king f7, rook h7 checkmate. So Gligorić played queen d4, which stops the queen h8 check I just mentioned. But now, the queen is not pinning the bishop on b3 anymore. So queen h7 check. And a lot of people wanted to play bishop takes e6 check, like me. However, if you see what Fischer did, you'll decide what Fischer did was better. Queen check, black resigned because of king f8, rook f1 check. And that's better than playing bishop takes e6 earlier, because although bishop takes e6 earlier, wasn't that just mate? Let me see this here. Bishop takes e6, queen h7 check. Okay, now I don't know which one is better. They're both checkmate. Okay, well, Fischer's the one who was playing. He decided this was a better checkmate in case black gave all his pieces away. But after queen h7, Gligorić resigned. So pretty brilliant attacking game from, at that time, when Fischer was 16. It's hard to understand this now because we live in different times. But people who were 16 weren't good. That's not the way it was. Okay, now, if you're 16, you're over the hill. But in 1959, teenagers didn't play in candidates tournaments. It wasn't like that. And the last 15 years, it's definitely like that. There were 3 players in the Toronto candidates, which just finished, who were 17, 18, and 20 years old. And that wasn't the case, in the 50s and 60s. We didn't see that. Okay, the next game is much more complicated, but it's cheating. And by cheating, I mean it's all prep. So even though it's 1959, the first 20 moves of this game were just preparation from both players' teams. So now with no engines, so maybe the prep's wrong. And this was actually round 1, Fischer Keres. Keres being one of the favorites in the tournament, being the 2nd or 3rd highest rated player in the world at this time. So they played a ton of preparation in a very sharp Sicilian Najdorf. This is the Najdorf. And bishop g5 used to be played about 90% of the time, and now it's virtually not played. But 50s, 60s, and 70s, everybody played bishop g5. Okay, bishop e7, and Fischer would also play queen b6. Try to play poison pawn, but okay, he didn't this game. And in this position, in the 60s and 70s, everybody played g4 here. Bishop e2, I'm not that familiar with. b5, now the fun starts. Takes, e5, attacking the rook in the corner and the knight on f6. But don't worry, it's all prep. Bishop b7, and Keres played super exciting. E takes f6. Bishop takes queen. Bishop takes, threatening the rook on a8 and the bishop on e7. Bishop takes f6. Bishop takes a8. And d5 traps the bishop. And both players know this position. This is their prep. And not only does black want to eventually win the bishop, black's also threatening queen takes f4 check, which wins the knight on d4. So d5 did more than one thing. So currently, white has a rook and 2 knights for a queen and 2 pawns. So yeah, that could go either way. It depends on king safety and piece activity. Probably we would prefer white if the bishop was on f3, not on, on a8. Okay, bishop takes d5. This is still Keres's prep. Bishop takes d4, takes. So now white only has a rook, a knight, and a pawn for a queen, which is about right, but black's king isn't looking so good. The queen moves, rook e1 check, king f8. And I don't know if the preparation for Keres ended here or it continues, but I'm going to guess it ended around here. And maybe Keres thought, black's king is no good, black's rook is no good. I didn't really sacrifice anything. I have a rook, knight, and pawn for a queen, so I like my chances. Okay, he played c3, defending his rook. h5. Fischer can't get his rook out a normal way, so he decides he's going to play rook h6 and get his rook out that way. f5, rook f6, and Keres sacrifices a pawn, so Fischer can't get his rook out, plays f6. G takes f, knight f4. So white is going to try to checkmate black by playing something like rook d8 check, and then the other rook to e8, and the black king isn't looking so good. h4, and that's what Keres does. So if it was white's turn to move, white just gives checkmate with the 2 rooks. Rook g8, rook h8, and then the other rook to g8 mate. Fischer checks. Checks again. And now white's not threatening mate anymore because the king can run out somewhere. Fischer plays rook g6. His king has h6. And as a result of the opening preparation and a couple moves after it, it looks like this didn't work out for white. His position looked good, and then a few moves later, he sacrificed a pawn, didn't get enough compensation, and black's king is safe. g3. White could play rook h8, threatening rook g8 mate with advantage. And I assume, since I see no other move, black would play f5, and the king could escape to f6. So he played g3, and they just played this endgame where black has a queen for a rook and a knight, so black should win with the passed pawn. And the best thing about this game from now on is the very end of the game. And the game was adjourned. It's not easy to win. White has a pretty good blockade of black's f-pawn. Then they took each other's pawns. Unfortunately, white's pawns aren't as dangerous. And in this position, white can resign, but white did something funnier. I don't know if he missed checkmate or he thought it was funny. But it doesn't matter what white does, white's going to lose. White can't really make a good move here. But he played here, and he got checkmated in the middle of the board, which is a funny checkmate. You don't see that very often. And that was actually round 1 of the candidates tournament. So Fischer started out with a win against Keres, who eventually came in second. Flip the board. Some of these games may be familiar to you because of the book My 60 Memorable Games. And some of these games are in Fischer's book. This is his game with Benko. Now, some of you know my good friend Wes Berger. Wes is in his 80s now, and Wes was playing chess in the 50s, 60s, and 70s mainly. And I was talking to him in Toronto. He came to watch the candidates also. And we were talking about grandmasters he had played. And he pointed out, not only had he played Benko, but he drew Benko. So go Wes. I've never played Benko or Fischer, so I got nothing. Okay, and Benko was Hungarian, and in this tournament, he was listed as stateless, and eventually he played for the US. Okay, so we saw this position earlier against Gligorić. Queen b6, and Gligorić played bishop d7. e6 is the most common move, and queen b6, again, is what I recommend in my chessable course. Knight e2, I faced knight e2 once when I had black. e6, and black shouldn't be unhappy here. Black's position's perfectly fine. Fischer played king h1 because he wants to play f4, and f pawn was pinned. Okay, now the next 5 or 10 moves, Benko plays a way that I wouldn't play, and as a consequence of his unusual play, he gets a poor position. So if I was black, I would probably play a6 and move my queen and play b5, fianchetto my bishop. But Benko plays knight a5, which is okay. Bishop g5, queen c5 I wouldn't even consider. And the point of playing knight e2 in this line is later you want to play bishop g5, which he did, and then knight g3 and knight h5, and attack on the king side. Benko played queen c5 for 2 reasons. It attacks the bishop on g5 and prepares black to play b5. f4, b5. Knight g3, b4. So very exciting. And Fischer plays e5, the most exciting move. Now all the pieces are hanging. Advantage Fischer when all the pieces are hanging. So if I was playing this game when I was a good player and I had black, I would definitely lose on time. I would think forever on every move, and even if I figured it out and played the right moves, by move 23 or 24, I would have no time on my clock, because these positions are too complicated for me. And Fischer's bread and butter, these king side versus queen side attacks. Okay, he took on e5, which is actually what I would do. Then bishop takes f6. G takes f6. If you take with the bishop, I could play knight e4, and I could still take your bishop, or play knight h5 and queen g4. And you can see white is getting a big initiative. So he took with the g pawn, knight e4 anyway. Black wants to trade queens. White wants to checkmate black. Knight takes b3, and Fischer plays queen h6. He's ignoring the losing of all his pieces because knight h5, queen g7 mate is more important. E takes f4, and the idea is if you play knight h5, threatening mate, I can play f5, defending against the mate. Very similar to the other game we looked at in the Dragon. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. We play rook d1. That way the rook's not hanging. Because if white had played knight f6 check immediately, black can sack his queen, and then black can take the rook on a1. And material's not so bad for black. I'll still take white, but it's better for white to play rook d1 first, not lose his rook, and then play knight f6. And white has a queen for 2 pieces. And this forks the rook and the knight. For some reason, Benko didn't resign. And here Benko resigned because he's down a queen for a rook. So it's funny, like opening sort of equal, and then as soon as it gets complicated, it reminds me of a lot of Kasparov games where Fischer just outcalculates his opponent. It's not clear where Benko went wrong. He just was immediately losing after White played knight e4 and knight h5. Although I've never been a fan of this knight here, knight takes idea because it takes too long for black. I think black should be more concerned with development. So another great game from Fischer. And I think we're all Fischered out. So we'll look at a game by the tournament winner, Mikhail, and he's playing former world champion Vasily Smyslov. And Smyslov was a very solid player who didn't lose very often. So the speed of this game in which it ended was quite surprising. And Tal played d3, which is unusual for him. And now Tal played a move that he's well known for, d4. And this is the way White would play now. So they trade. And okay, White has 3 pieces out and Black has 1 piece out. So White's better. Black is very solid, obviously. 2 bishops of Vatals. This attacks the bishop. I'm sorry. This puts pressure on the bishop on g5, but more importantly, it stops knight f5, which would have been a good move for White. And it attacks a2. Bishop c4. And I mean, you can tell as a consequence of the opening, White is doing very well. White basically has more space. Pieces are better developed. Pieces on the queen side are no good. Smyslov played b5. Now bishop went to d2, attacking the queen. And he played queen a6 because he still wants to take on a2 later, if possible. Knight f5. Queen h4, sacrificing a piece because he's tall. Queen h4 is a move that wouldn't be on my radar if I was playing a tournament game. I mean, I would be playing bishop b3. Okay, that's why he was the world champion, and I'm giving a lecture. So queen h4, Smyslov says thank you. Queen g5, threatening checkmate with queen g7 mate. I'm afraid games like this will encourage trying to learn to sack all his pieces and play for mate. Because, you know, sometimes it works. It also works more often when you calculate as well as Tal does. Okay, Black has to stop mate. So he played knight h5, which is a very unusual way to stop mate, because the knight's hanging on h5. But the knight defends g7, and the bishop on d8 is attacking the queen. Tal plays knight h6 check. Smyslov played the engine move before there were engines. King h8, good move. Queen takes h5. And in this position, Smyslov played queen takes a2, threatening queen a1 mate. Bishop c3. And here Smyslov made the losing move, though it's possible this position's not good for Black, since White has this big attack. Basically, Black has a check on a1, but then I play king d2, and that's the end of your attack. A lot of people wrote Smyslov overlooked Tal's next move. I don't know if that's true, but he played knight f6. And that's the losing move. It looks good, gets the knight into the game, blocks the bishop on c3, attacks the queen. Sounds good. And of course, Tal sacrificed his queen because he's tall, and he played queen takes f7. And the queen's poisoned because rook takes d8 leads to checkmate. Okay, so he played queen a1 check. And now rook takes d8 doesn't lead to checkmate because rook takes d8 is illegal. That's why Smyslov played queen a1 check. So now he took the queen. And when the dust settles, white's up an exchange and a pawn, and black has no comp. The end of the game is pretty funny. This position, white can play king takes knight, which most people would play without thinking, and that does win. But then black plays bishop b7, gets his piece back, and black's bishops are pretty nice. Although they're not that nice. I mean, white's still winning. But Tal played bishop d4, which is easier. Now Tal's threatening the bishop because the a pawn is pinned, and the knight on e4 is attacked, and black has nothing now. Bishop d4 is a funny final move when you could have played king takes knight on e4. But I think bishop d4 is better. So, good technique till the end. So that was a game where Smyslov got rolled over pretty easily, considering, you know, he was the world champion. So you shouldn't beat Smyslov so quickly. But occasionally, Tal would win games, you know, in 20, 25 moves, even against the best players in the world, because he calculated better and he got them in positions they didn't like. So the Candidates Tournament in 1959 was a really strong tournament, which of the 8 players featured 4 former and future world champions. Fischer played in the Candidates when he was 16. He had a lot of exciting games. And not only did Tal win the Candidates Tournament, he then beat Botvinnik in their world championship match. And one thing most people don't know, unless you've watched my streams, is when Botvinnik became world champion until, I guess it was Petrosian, world champion never won a match. Whoever was the reigning world champion, when they played a world championship match, they either lost or drew. And when Botvinnik was the world champion, he never won a match. He would only win the return matches when the other guy was the world champion. So that shows you the people who were picked from the candidates and interzonals to qualify to play for the world championship, they were worthy. Those people weren't kidding around. And that's the case today, because it's not clear to me who the favorite is in the upcoming world championship match between Gligorić and Ding. I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. Please like and subscribe and leave a comment. I want to thank our sponsor, Philip Siller, and I'll be with you next time with more weekly lectures. See you guys. Bye.